$12,000. That was the price of my shame and my awakening. The police officer looked at my bank statement and his expression slid from mocking disbelief to genuine surprise. My children's laughter still echoed in my ears the morning I walked into the station alone. "Mom, you're too naive," they had said, laughing, when I told them about Eduardo, my online boyfriend. My hands shook as I held the papers that showed every transfer, every gift sent to a man who did not exist. A cold sweat ran down my back as the officer's attitude changed. The screen on my phone lit up with another message: "My love, I need a little more to fix this emergency." That would be the last cent I would see. To understand why it hurts so much, you need to know who I am. That scene I just told you didn't happen out of nowhere. It landed like a thunderclap on a life that had been built, slowly and quietly, over decades. You should know the small architecture of my days to understand why that thunder broke me open. I live in a small apartment in Condesa, in Mexico City. The neighborhood hums with bikes, street vendors, and radios that drift through open windows. My building has a narrow stairwell. The paint is peeling at the corner by the third-floor landing. There is a door that never closes all the way, it stays just ajar like an old habit. The door is a private image I carry with me now. It is the first visual symbol of how my life used to be, open, trusting, half exposed to the world. I have lived in this apartment for 30 years. I paid it off with overtime and stubbornness. I have a small table, scarred from a lifetime of hands setting dishes and bills. The radio in my kitchen is old and stubborn too. It plays the same station my mother used to like. The photos on the wall are not new. They are not arranged for show. They are the remnants of mornings, afternoons, and years: a child in a hospital cap, a graduation with a crooked smile, a housewarming with a cake that melted in the heat because we forgot to buy candles. I am a woman who learned to hold things so they wouldn't break. I learned how to sew uniforms on a second-shift machine while my youngest slept with his head on the counter. I learned how to get up at night and measure medicine for a patient who had no one. I learned how to say, "It will be okay," and make it sound true even when it was not. There are hands I remember, rough, competent hands, because a lifetime of nursing leaves its signature on you. Those hands have straightened sheets, held trembling ones, and bandaged small, honest wounds. They also learned to hide what hurt. I became a widow at 35. The funeral was a small collection of people who cried and then left to get on with their lives. I stayed. I worked double shifts as a nurse. I worked nights and holidays. I kept the apartment and the children and the budget. I learned to stretch the peso until it had no more stretch left. I won a promotion with evening courses, while other mothers were able to go out. I did not go out much. I had little left for myself. But I had pride in the way my children wore clean uniforms and went to school without asking for much. My philosophy has always been simple: family first. My mother said it to me in a voice that was a mix of command and prayer. "Respect is earned by what you do," she said, and I carried that like a rule book. I proved that rule every time I paid a tuition, every time I delivered a packed lunch, every time I ran to a pharmacy at midnight. Respect, to me, was quiet work. I never taught my children to count every coin or weigh every favor. I believed then that shielding them from the worry was a kindness. I gave and I thought giving was enough. I gave till my own wants were small and almost invisible even to me. I gave so the house would be a place that hummed with food and laughter, even if it often hummed with tension under the surface. I kept my pride like a folded napkin, present but out of sight. My children called me strong. They praised my sacrifices in a way that felt like both honor and distance. For years, Diego handled my pension. He offered it, the first time, with the softest of justifications. "It's better this way, Mom," he said. "You don't have to worry about bank nonsense." He set up a system and I trusted him. I was grateful and tired and relieved. The envelope of my pension became a monthly ritual. I handed it to him the way I had once handed him a blanket as a child, believing I was doing the right thing. I believed him the way one believes a child who will always do right. I believed him because he was my son. I raised 3 children, Diego, Carmen and Javier, with a discipline that mixed firmness and a quiet love. I never wanted them to feel the weight of scarcity the way I did. So I learned to swallow my complaints and smile. I learned to make small economies into feasts. I learned to say, "We'll manage," and mean it. Those words were a kind of armor. I thought armor was all I needed. People often reduce my life to a few lines: widow, nurse, mother. But those labels hide the hours, the cold visits to relatives, the sleepless nights at the hospital, the bus rides with a threadbare coat. They don't say how I negotiated with landlords or how I saved coins in a tobacco tin to buy a pair of shoes for the cold. They don't tell you that when my husband left, his last act, small and secret, was to place a notarized letter making me the sole beneficiary of his life insurance. I kept that letter in a metal box under my bed, next to my birth certificate and an old ID card. That box was my secret altar for a long time. It made me feel protected. It made me feel sane. I must pause here and say thank you to you, the one listening. If you are still with me, please, if this channel helps you, consider subscribing. We are a small channel with big stories, and your support helps us reach 1,000 subscribers. Tell me in the comments where you are from, city and country, because these stories are not mine alone. They belong to the many women who still carry similar afternoons. Thank you for being here. The days after I retired were quieter but not empty. The house slowed down and kept its temperature. Sundays were for family. I would begin cooking early, stirring mold that would simmer and perfume the place. The radio would be low. The kitchen light would be warm, almost apologetic. Those mornings I felt like a small architect of comfort. I planned menus the way other people plan voyages. Diego's family would arrive first, with Lucia and the grandchildren. Carmen would come later. Javier, the wild card, would arrive when he wanted, with stories that piled like newspapers. We sat around a table I paid for in installments after my husband's death. The table had a nick that reminded me of a winter when we could not afford butter. We made jokes about it and then kept eating. These scenes were my daily film, repeated until it became habit. And still, there was a distance. My kids had lives full of decisions I had not been privy to. Diego was often distracted, pushing his phone like a talisman. He spoke in half answers about expenses and investments. I trusted him. I wanted to trust him. It seemed natural to do so. Old habits are like furniture, you don't notice them until you trip. There are small humiliations that don't announce themselves loudly. They come as jokes. "Mom, you should get a computer," Javier said once, tucking a finger behind his ear. "You're living in the past." He laughed and tapped his screen. Carmen would smirk when I pronounced a word wrong or when I read a message aloud with the wrong intonation. I felt it in those moments, the gentle exile of being made small because of your age or lack of skill. I swallowed it. I learned to laugh the way one laughs to stop coughing. I stayed silent, but not forgotten. I stayed silent, but I kept counting. When Lupita invited me to a free computer course at the community center, a tiny door opened. She was a neighbor who had the habit of knitting and bringing tamales. She looked at me like the sister I did not know I needed and said it plainly, "It's free and it's for us." I went. My hands, which had learned to count pills by touch, were clumsy on the keyboard. My eyes, Used to read. When Diego walked in that day and found me chatting, he took the phone from my hand like someone retrieving an object from a table. His voice was sharp. "Who are you talking to so much?" he demanded. His fingers were too quick on my screen. He read. His face did something I had rarely seen. It hardened, then softened into a patronizing smile. "You are being foolish, Mom," he said. "These are scams." They gathered around me that night, my children, their certainty like a shield. They spoke fast and loud, as if volume could stitch the worry. They called these men crooks. They warned me about lonely people being prey. I felt small in my own living room, a child again under adult judgment. The laughter returned, but now it was sharper. "Mom, you're naive," they said. I felt the world tilt. I went to bed feeling infantilized in my own home. But the seed of doubt had been planted like a coin dropped into a slot. The photo Eduardo had sent lingered in my mind. It suited him, that face and that uniform. I woke in the middle of the night and the image refused to leave. I went back to the laptop the next morning and remembered what Mariana had taught us. If a picture is used elsewhere, you will find it. She taught us reverse image search as if it were a simple spell. I typed the method into the search box and pressed enter. My heart knocked in a different rhythm as pages filled with the same image. The face belonged to a man with a hospital profile in Canada. The name under it was not Eduardo. The fabric of the story began to shimmer. I felt my confidence slip like water from a glass. The room tilted. I was dizzy. I thought, for the first time, that my curiosity had cost me more than a moment's foolishness. I did not cry then. I sat very still and watched the pages. Then I called Mariana and met her at the community center. She reached for my hand like she was offering me a life jacket. She did not judge. She sat with me while we pulled up my conversations. My messages were laid out like stitches that had come undone. There were small lies, little inconsistencies. Then the emergency messages. "I'm sick," he had said. "My account is locked. Please, just this once." The words were precise and practiced. "Do you have access to your online account?" Mariana asked. Her voice was steady, too steady. I thought of the metal box under my bed. I thought of the notarized letter from my husband. I felt a strange collapse, not only from romance, but from a lifetime of giving. I answered, "My son manages everything. But I still have my cards and my pins." Mariana looked at me with a soft, furious pity. "We need to look. Now." She said it not as a suggestion but as a command. I felt relief in the command. Action was a new thing. We went through my online statements together. The numbers were clinical, precise. The transfers to Eduardo added up to almost $12,000 in 1 month. The sequence of withdrawals and small ATM transactions showed a rhythm that matched my son's routine. My stomach turned cold as I scrolled. There were withdrawals I did not remember authorizing. Small amounts, then larger ones, spaced like someone making a habit. The dates matched vacations, purchases I had learned about at family dinners, and flights I had not been told about. When I widened the timeline, the pattern did not change. It stretched back years. The pension, the savings, the insurance payout all diminished like a tide leaving shells behind. My hands shook as I printed the statements, one by one. Paper filled my lap, warm from the printer. I felt like a mother gathering proof for a school accusation she never wanted to make. Mariana sat with me in the hum of the center. She handed me tissues and a bottle of water. I let the tears come then, quietly, like a faucet finally opened. "This is more than a romantic scam," she said. "This is financial abuse." Those words landed like a stone in my chest. Abuse. The word itself was sharp and foreign. I had thought of abuse as something physical, visible. I had been sleeping next to a pattern. I thought of every Sunday envelope I had handed Diego. I thought of every time he told me, "It's for your own good." I thought of the nights I had worked double shifts so the children could have what they needed. I realized I had been both the well and the bucket. I had supplied the family with water while someone else was dipping his hands into it. I stayed silent, but not forgotten. I stayed silent, but my silence was full of evidence. I left the community center with more than a bruise in my heart. I left with a plan brewing like a kettle. I took a small, decisive step. I moved the metal box with the notarized letter and the deeds from beneath the bed to the kitchen drawer. I put a small ribbon on the box that had been my secret altar, a ribbon my mother had once used on a wedding gift. It felt like marking territory. It felt like an offering. That night, the apartment felt different. The light through the living room window cut a line across the table. The line looked like a scar in the floorboards. I touched it and thought of all the small things that, added together, make a life. I thought about respect and what my mother had told me. Respect is earned by what you do. I had earned a lifetime. I would not let it be diminished. The truth was a weight and a tool. I would use it. But first I had to gather everything that belonged to me and make it visible. I had to find the courage to take my life back from people who had thought it was theirs. I closed the door of my apartment that night and felt the click like a small victory. The door, which had always been a little ajar, the half-open door of earlier days, finally shut. The sound was small, but it was mine. I was no longer going to be merely trusted because I had been a mother. I was going to be careful because I had been wise enough to learn. The next morning, I would begin to move. But the worst was still to be discovered. The worst I would learn had roots further back than Eduardo's messages. I would not stay quiet forever. 6 months ago, mornings were predictable. The neighborhood woke to the sound of a fruit cart and a woman sweeping in a rhythm that matched the heart. My kitchen smelled of mole and coffee. The radio whispered old songs and the kettle hummed like a small, consistent engine. I would stand at the stove stirring, feeling the heat on my forearms and the world outside continue moving on its own schedule. Sunday was ritual. I began at dawn, chopping, stirring, tasting. I put the tablecloth on and adjusted the salt in the rice. The table that had held birthdays and bills and homework sat at the center of the room. Its surface was worn, the center polished from decades of hands. I set out plates and the heavy serving spoon with the nick. The nick in the spoon had a history. One winter when we could not afford to replace utensils, when someone dropped it on the floor and a small chip remained. I would always use that spoon. It was a small sign to myself that everything could be mended. Diego's family usually arrived first. He walked in with keys that jingled like a small show of status. Lucia carried a bag with fruit that she bought at the market. The grandchildren bounded around, demanding stories and refusing to eat vegetables. Carmen often came later, with a precise smile and a critique ready to drop like a pebble into conversation. Javier would arrive when he felt like showing up, with a grin and a phone with new jokes. We would sit and eat. Plates were passed. Voices overlapped. Someone would comment on the television, someone else on politics. It felt like a small world held inside a bigger world. We orbited around one another like familiar satellites. Diego had a habit. After the plates were cleared, he would take my checkbook or tablet and look over things. He said it was easier. "It saves you worry, Mama," he would say. His voice carried an assumption. that I would be grateful for his control. There was another tension I could not ignore, the way my children spoke about technology as if it were a foreign language and they were the only translators. "Mom, it's better this way," Diego said, when I tried to open my bank app. He leaned over the phone screen and explained decisions in a language that placed me outside. I felt both grateful and excluded. The feeling of being edged out was a sting. One quiet night, after everyone had gone, I sat with the bowls stacked on the sink. The apartment was dim and the light in the living room cast my photos in soft silhouettes. I looked at a picture of Diego as a child with freckles and a gap in his teeth and felt a swell of tenderness that was also helplessness. Memories mixed with a growing sense of unease. I could taste the mole I had made that Sunday, and the taste had gone bitter in my mouth. I began to trace timelines in my head like a detective. I asked myself the small questions I had avoided. When did the trips begin? When did the new car appear? When were new appliances brought in? Each memory, when pinned against a printed statement, began to line up. The dates matched. The pattern sharpened. Yet, there were small acts of love that complicated the picture. Diego would come and take down a light bulb for me. He would sit for a while and listen to the radio. He would bring his children to my house on holidays and hold my hand in a way that said, "We are family." Those moments made the betrayal worse, not easier. I wanted to believe those acts were proof of goodness. I wanted to use those acts to deny the evidence. But love does not erase theft. Love, in that messy human way, coexists with harm. There was a Tuesday when a package arrived at my door with a small gift for me from an unknown sender, a scarf in a bright color I would have chosen, a note that said, "For your warmth." I thought of Eduardo's messages. I thought of the man in the photos. I felt both charmed and foolish. I wrapped the scarf and put it on the back of a chair where I could see it. The object felt like a marker of a life I wanted to have again, small gestures, attention. But it would become, later, part of the archive. 2 micro-conflicts grew louder during that period. The first was between me and Carmen. She began to argue with me about my stubbornness when I insisted on keeping certain old receipts and papers. "You are hoarding for no reason," she said one afternoon, with the lunch plates between us. "Throw them away, Mama. They are just junk." Her tone suggested that my memory was outdated, that documents were only for the paranoid. Her voice stung because I had preserved those papers for a purpose I could barely name. The second micro-conflict involved a conversation in the elevator that slid into a public, humiliating place. A neighbor, overhearing me on the phone trying to explain something about my son's help, made a passing remark loud enough for others to hear. "Aren't you the one who always managed everything? Now look, relying on others." Someone laughed. I blushed and felt my throat contract. The comment was small, but it cut into my core because it used my past strength as evidence of present weakness. The world began to recast me as a woman who could not manage. That image made me angry in a way that woke me up. Home became a stage where small humiliations were repeated, a casual insult at dinner, a helpful correction in front of guests, a sarcastic joke. Diego sometimes spoke in a tone that made me feel like a child. Once, at a family lunch, he intercepted a question I asked about a bill and answered for me. His words were fast, rehearsed. "Mama doesn't need to worry, she is safe with us." The subtext was clear. He was asserting control by declaring me incapable. I held my calm like a fragile cup. I did not want to be the source of family turmoil. I had always believed that peace in the house was worth a concession. I had prioritized the family's comfort over my own pride. That very value had allowed the erosion to happen. But something shifted. The same week I found Eduardo's images on Google and discovered the duplicity. another small incident made the fissure larger. I went to the post office to pick up a registered letter. The clerk handed me an envelope and, for some reason, I opened it there. It was a statement of account showing transfers I did not recognize. My hands trembled. There, in black and white, was the record I had started to suspect. I called Diego that afternoon and asked a question quietly, a test. Why was there a withdrawal last month on the 12th? I asked. His voice changed. There was a pause long enough for the line to crack. I took care of something for you, Mama, he said. You would not have understood. The phrase landed like a small verdict. I could have let it be. I could have sat down and swallowed it like so many other things. Instead, I began to collect. I started to write down dates and amounts. I made a pile on my table: invoices, printed bank pages, notes. My hands were steady now, because steady hands come from focus. I taped them into folders. The folders looked like a slow construction project. Each paper was a brick. I also began another small action that felt like a boundary. When the children began to ask for money or to borrow, what I called my weekly, I started to refuse. I declined on a Wednesday when Javier stopped by asking for cash. He sulked and left. I stood in the doorway after he walked away and felt a new sensation rise in me, a mix of fear and relief. Saying no was like shutting a window you had kept open too long. There were consequences. Carmen accused me of being hard and unreasonable. She brought up old debts I had forgiven and said I was making family life uncomfortable. The grandchildren asked why there were no more Sunday desserts. The house changed. It lost some of its easy warmth. But it gained something else. It gained edges. I began to feel something that was not just reaction but protection. Around this time, Mariana began to accompany me in practical ways. She taught me how to save screenshots, how to archive messages, how to print records. She helped me organize an evidence folder with tabs. If you ever need to go to a lawyer, you must have this, she said. I listened like someone learning a new trade. It felt like arming myself with the tools of the world I had been kept from. When I finally confronted Diego, and I will tell you how that day arrived in another part of this story, I did so armed with facts and a determination that surprised me. I remember standing at my table, showing him the printed account transfers, and watching him look at paper like it was a foreign language. He stammered that the withdrawals were for investments and promised he would return the money. He begged, he rationalized. I listened like a judge listening to excuses. It was not an easy moment. It was messy and horrible. He cried and then tried to put his arm around me. I took a step back and felt my skin tighten like a shield. I was not the same woman who accepted explanations without proof. I had gathered proof. I had made the invisible visible. The small acts of my life, the spoon nick, the scarf on the chair, the radio in the corner, began to feel like witnesses. They watched me set boundaries and collect evidence. They saw the woman who had been the pillar become the woman who protects what she has left. There is no dramatic single moment that breaks a life. Harm accrues. Harm compounds. But then there is a day when you decide you will no longer be the receptacle of it. That day arrived not as a blaze but as a cold, steady decision. On a late evening, I sat at the table and folded the evidence into envelopes labeled with dates. I placed the notarized letter and the deeds in a separate folder and wrapped it in a ribbon. I called Mariana and told her I had arranged to see a lawyer. She told me to be careful, and then she said something that felt like permission. You do not have to forgive what is not yours to forgive. The sentence landed like a bell. Kalei, mas neo skc. I stayed silent for a long time, but I was saving my voice for a moment that mattered. And then came the day when I would no longer be. Once, when I asked for a receipt for a bill I had supposedly paid, Diego laughed too quickly and handed me a crumpled slip. Another time, I asked about a repair I had helped arrange years earlier and he blinked as if surprised I remembered. "You worry too much, Mama," he said, like a reprimand wrapped in a tender buttress. I swallowed those words the way I had swallowed others for 30 years, polite and soft so the room wouldn't tremble. Neighbors began to notice things, too. Senora Morales, who watered the plants downstairs, would linger at the stair landing with a question and an expression that was both gentle and inquisitive. "Your son seems busy with a new project," she said one afternoon, curling her broom in her hands. She said it as if the project were a neutral thing, but the look in her eye made it a statement about ownership. A small comment from a neighbor can feel like a thin needle. It comes with no accusation, only a suggestion. Those suggestions accumulate. At the market, Carmen straightened my coat sleeve as if I were a child, her fingers barely touching but enough to make me feel the distance. "Mom, you should get a new coat," she said brightly, as if kindness could be given as a shopping list. I felt a sting that smelled like laundry soap and diesel. I had wanted that coat for years, but I'd chosen the repair because responsibility was a habit. I nodded and thanked her, but the kindness sat like a pebble in my shoe. There were other small humiliations, public and sharp. In the lobby of our building, a neighbor overheard me talking on the phone and said loud enough for others to hear, "Aren't you the one who always managed everything? Now look, relying on others." Someone else laughed. The sound cut across me like wind over dry grass. I kept my face neutral, my voice steady. I did not want to make their lives uncomfortable. I did not want to be the one who caused trouble. The money was another quiet rupture. Every month I handed Diego the pension envelope because that was the way we had arranged life. He had introduced the system as a kindness. "You don't have to manage the bank, Mama," he told me with that particular patience he used when explaining a recipe to someone who'd cooked for years. It felt like a weight lifted. Later, I would see that the weight had been transferred to a different shoulder. There were moments of tenderness, too, that made the betrayal harder to hold. Diego would replace a light bulb for me without being asked. He would take a minute to sit and listen to the radio. He would smile and hold my hand with a grip that said we were family. Those gestures were not false. They made me want to keep believing that the music in our house was the old melody. They made the betrayals noiseless and therefore more dangerous. 2 micro-conflicts began to rub against me like rough cloth. The first was with Carmen. She insisted I throw away old papers I had kept for reasons I couldn't quite name. "You're hoarding, Mama," she said one afternoon, the plates between us a bright line of accusation. "Those receipts are useless." Her words were not cruel. They were utilitarian. But the friction they created was real because those papers were the only maps I had tracing our family's money. Throwing them away would be like erasing parts of myself. The second micro-conflict moved from private to public. In the elevator, someone joked about a senior being out of date because she didn't use an app. The comment landed on me as if I were a vulnerable thing to be observed. I felt a hot shame. I felt the history of all the nights I worked late, the bowls I washed alone, the times I covered for sickness and trouble fold into that moment and break. That shame was not about one remark. It was the sum of 1,000 small adjustments I'd made to keep the family smooth. I began to collect small inconsistencies the way others collect stamps, neatly, with pride. A vacation mentioned at dinner that didn't line up with bank records. A purchase discussed as a good deal that mirrors a withdrawal date. A flight photo that appears with a date I knew we hadn't discussed. I started to map these tiny islands. Kalei, Mas Neo SKC. One evening, after the grandchildren had been tucked in and the radio was murmuring low, I sat with the stack of mail and a pen. I made a list of dates and small amounts, 200 here, 500 there, withdrawals that, alone, could be explained. Together, they made a pattern. I taped slips of paper into a small folder and labeled them. The folder was modest, like my life, but each paper felt like a witness. I also began to say no. It was a small thing at first. Javier stopped by asking for 100 pesos and I refused. He left sulking. It felt simultaneously like cruelty and release. Carmen accused me of being harsh. "Mama, you're making things hard," she said, but the truth was that I was making boundaries. The house felt thinner. The laughter was quieter. The warmth that had been habitual had a new edge. I started to pay attention to the rhythm of withdrawals. They had a cadence, like someone taking small sips rather than one big gulp. They matched vacations. They matched weekends when Diego's phone would blink through conversations I never saw. I printed statements from the years I could access and began to highlight lines with a yellow marker that I had once used for class notes. The highlighting made holes of light on the paper. The pattern took shape. A neighbor, Lupita, noticed the way I had stopped smiling the same way. She squeezed my hand one afternoon and said, "You should keep your papers. You never know." Her voice was a small buoy. She had been at the computer course with me and she had the habit of knitting and bringing tamales. She had always seen me as a reliable presence. Her words felt like permission. One night I opened the metal box under my bed and pulled out the notarized letter from my husband, the deeds, the little blank space where I had kept our memory finances. I put them on the table like a small altar. I touched the edge of the letter, and memory flared like a match. I thought of the nights I'd worked, the wages saved in cigarette tins for shoes in winter, the promissory note that had been a lifeline. And yet, even as the evidence gathered and my hands worked, there was a reluctance to name what I had begun to suspect. Denial is a soft blanket, it muffles the cold. It occurred to me in a low mumbled thought, maybe they were helping. Maybe Diego had made decisions in good faith. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. But the paper did not forgive. I called Mariana at the community center because facing this alone felt like wading through swamp water without a stick. She said kindly, "Bring what you have." When I walked into that small room, the smell of coffee and printer toner wrapped around me like an old friend. Mariana sat me down and took the folder with the calm of someone who had seen many shapes of trouble. We sat in the hum of the center and she opened my files like she opened lesson plans. Her face remained unreadable until she reached a page where the numbers spelled a story I had been afraid to read. She looked at me and said, quietly, "This is more than mismanagement." Her voice was a scalpel that cut through my comfort. There were moments I wanted to scream, to fling the papers across the room, to make the names and numbers meaningless again. But the numbers did not care for emotion. They simply were. And in the small, quiet center, with the afternoon light thinning, I felt the first real rush of something like anger, or maybe clarity. The old pattern of keeping the peace could no longer hold the truth. I left the community center with the folder under my arm and the box from under the bed tucked into my bag. It felt like carrying tools. It felt like carrying a small weapon. My front door, the one that used to be always just a little ajar, closed behind me with a firm, final click. The sound was small and it felt like an answer. I could no longer pretend everything was ordinary. I would not stay quiet. The day I typed the name into the search bar is a day I will never forget because the room did not only tilt, it fell away. I had learned a trick in class: if a picture is used elsewhere, you will find it. I had laughed at that before, the way you laugh at an old priest's promise. But now my hands were steady. I clicked the image icon and dropped the photo Eduardo had sent into the little box. Pages of, then they had faces of their own. $200 here, $500 there, often under the name of a bank I didn't recognize. I printed the transactions, a small, mechanical act that felt like casting lines to fish out what had been eaten from my account. When Mariana asked, "Do you have access to your online banking?" the sound of the question landed with the force of a bell. My first reflex was to protect Diego, to keep his dignity intact. "He handles all that," I said, and in the way the words left my mouth I heard a history. But then I added, almost to myself, "I still have my cards and my pins." Saying those words crystallized a responsibility I had allowed to slide away in the name of convenience. We logged in. The screen filled with dates and decimals. The transfers that looked like punctuation marks on paper suddenly became a sentence of theft. A message from Eduardo, at the end of March, "My engine failed, I can't access funds." A transfer on March 12th, $3,000. A withdrawal on March 20th that matched a hotel booking in a town I had never visited. The numbers moved in a pattern like hands on a clock. They pointed to a face. And then the other pattern emerged, the quieter one, withdrawals from ATMs, small amounts, spaced out in a way that didn't set off immediate alarms. 25 here, 50 there, but carried out with the familiarity of someone who knew the rhythm of my life. The dates matched family dinners, weekends of absence. The detail that knotted my stomach was that those withdrawals mirrored Diego's comings and goings. They were not random. They were routine. I printed everything. Multiplied pages filled my lap. The printer whirred as if it were creating evidence for a trial I had not yet decided to bring. Each print was a small, concrete thing, a date, an amount, a place. I stacked them like bricks. Mariana and I taped and labeled. We clipped conversations. We circled the lines where he had asked for, just a little more, for medical care. The folder grew heavy and warm. I felt shame at first. The shame is not rational, it is communal. It is the memory of my children laughing at me when they called Eduardo a scam. "You are too naive," they said. The laughter had been a salt on the open wound. Now, in the face of the paper, that shame changed shape and became something like righteous indignation. I had been tricked, yes, but I had also been robbed by the hands closest to me. Mariana suggested we check other accounts, the ones that existed before Diego began to take over. We opened a timeline that reached back years. The pattern did not start with Eduardo. Eduardo was the sharp, fresh cut, the other had been a slow erosion. There were transfers that matched a promise to place money in safe investment accounts. There were withdrawals that matched weekends at places I had not been told about. There was the insurance money my husband had bequeathed me, the money I thought was invested for my future. The realization arrived like a cold wave. This was not just an opportunistic theft from a stranger. It was a pattern of extraction orchestrated by someone who had daily access to my life. I called Patricia, the lawyer Mariana had mentioned. Her voice was calm and efficient. She did not let pity fold into her words. "Bring everything," she said. "We will make copies, we will prepare a complaint if necessary." Hearing that complaint organized the chaos of my emotions into a pathway forward. There is a peculiar relief in turning grief into paperwork. It becomes manageable. That night I dreamt of the nick in my table. In the dream the nick widened into a fissure that ran across the floorboards of my life. I woke with my heart loud in my throat, and then I reached for the metal box under my bed. The documents were there, the letter from my husband naming me beneficiary, the deed to the apartment, my INE card. Each paper was a relic and a promise. Whoever had touched that money had touched the history of our family. I opened the laptop and pulled up the messages from Eduardo again. His pleas had a cadence like a lullaby designed to soothe. "Don't worry," he had written. "I'll pay you back." Those words made the paper cold to my touch. I realized, with a clarity that felt like a strike, that the scammer had known how to speak to my habit of trust. He had used intimacy as a lever and loneliness as a tool. There was another moment, sudden and humiliating. I found a message in which Eduardo thanked me for the gifts and promised to meet soon. The last message was a blank space, a promise with no date. My heart hammered against my ribs as if trying to escape the betrayal. But the most painful proof was not the messages. It was the pattern of withdrawals in my own name that had been moved out. The money that had been accumulated over decades from wages, overtime, savings had been siphoned into lives that were not mine. It was the proof that the trust one had placed in my child had been converted into a justification to take. The thought of that of Diego treating my life as a line item made my hands go numb. Mariana sat beside me and held my hands for a rare beat that felt like a benediction. She did not lecture. She did not give me platitudes. Instead, she said, "We will document. We will go to the bank. We will speak to Patricia." The words were simple, precise instruments. I wrapped my fingers around them the way I had once wrapped my hands around the call bell in a hospital ward. The decision to go to the bank came with a peculiar fear. I thought of their bland desks, the soft carpet, the manager's polite face. I pictured them calling me a gullible older woman. I imagined Diego's voice, furious and wounded. But the paperwork was a weight in my bag that demanded action. I went with Mariana at my side. At the bank, the manager's expression shifted as soon as he saw the printed statements. The smile left his face like a curtain falling. "Mrs. Navarro, we will open an investigation," he said, and I watched the machinery of a system that had previously been abstract start to move. It was bureaucratic and slow and also utterly necessary. They recommended opening a new account, preserving funds, and canceling any prior authorizations. That evening I sat alone at the kitchen table with the folder of printed transactions and the photocopies stacked like a small fort. There was no grand exclamation of triumph. There was only the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the sound of paper rubbing against paper. I began to understand that my life, the careful life I had built, had a small, hidden fracture. The fracture had allowed others to take without asking. But the discovery had lit a lamp on the map, and I could see the lines now. I felt fury, yes. And I felt a sorrow so wide it could have drowned me. Yet under both there was a steady, very small resolve. I would not let this pass into the dust of old confessions. I would not hide the paper back under the bed and pretend it had never been there. They had taken money, but I would take back my voice. The folder closed with a soft, decisive thud. I knew what I had to do next. I would not be silent about what I had found. The nights after the discovery were slow and heavy as old curtains. I lay awake listening to the building settle, the faint strains of a late radio downstairs, my own breathing like a metronome keeping time with a decision I had not yet named. Sometimes I held the stack of printed statements to my chest like a small animal and felt the heat of paper and the coolness of proof. Other times I walked the apartment and touched the objects that had been witness to my life, the nicked spoon, the chipped teapot, the radio with the faded dial. They were small, loyal things. Sleep came in short bursts and with it came memories that had been pressed down like pages in a book. I remembered nights at the hospital where I had sat with a young widow whose hands trembled like leaves. I remembered teaching Carmen to tie her shoelaces and comforting Diego when he scraped his knee on the playground. Each memory had once been a stitch in the blanket of my life. Now they were threads that showed where the fabric had been pulled. My mind replayed small moments with a new eye. Little excuses from Diego that had once calmed me now rang false. "I paid that bill," he had said, brushing off a question about a receipt. My mother had crossed an ocean to build a life out of nothing. She had not allowed herself to be small. It is strange how clarity grows like a weed, in the cracks where pain has come. One afternoon I stood in front of my mirror and looked long at the woman looking back. The small lines around my mouth did not make me wrong. They told stories. I straightened my shoulders and said out loud, not to anyone but the kitchen radio, "I will not be taken from again." Saying it felt like picking up a stone and pocketing it for when needed. I began to make lists. Not of amounts though, those lists I had already made, but of steps. Protect the accounts. Change passwords. Find legal counsel. Document everything with dates and witnesses. Make copies. Whoever had thought to take from me had relied on chaos and my acquiescence. The antidote was order. A surprising calm came with this clarity. The work of justice could be methodical. I called Patricia and made an appointment. Her office smelled of paper and coffee. Her desk was a map of small labeled folders. She listened without surprise, the way a person who has done this work listens, not with judgment but with procedure. "We will do this carefully," she said. "We will give your son a chance to fix this, but we will also protect what you have left while we work." Her voice was a blueprint. That morning she taught me how to copy bank statements properly, how to request an audit, how to request account freezes. In her hands, legal language became practical safety. I also began to change small habits that had given others access. I started keeping my cards in a drawer I locked at night. I stopped handing over my pension envelope without checking a copy into my folder. I wrote down each time someone asked for money and the reason they gave. These were not grand acts, they were the slow building of a wall. There were social costs. When I began to decline requests for money, when I refused to be the bank without terms, there were tears and accusations. Carmen called me hard. "You're making everything messy, Mama," she said. "We are family, we should help each other." I understood where the words came from, a culture of assumed obligations, a belief that familial needs bend ethics. I also realized this, helping does not mean allowing harm. Boundaries are a different language of care. Javier's reaction surprised me. He looked ashamed and then, in a way that felt like a tentative gift, he offered to come by more often. "I'll stay with you, Ma," he said, as if proximity could be restitution. I accepted, partly because it eased the measure of the house and partly because the presence of another person pointing a lamp on the problem made it seem less like a phantom. There were practical moves, too. I went to the bank with Patricia and opened a new account strictly in my name, with new passwords and a second factor I controlled. We removed any standing authorizations Diego had. The teller's initial skepticism melted when she saw Patricia's composed file. "We will thoroughly review the transactions," the manager promised. The word "review" felt like a small bell of mercy. At home I began to reorganize the physical artifacts of my life. The metal box stayed on the table for longer hours. I took photos of every page and saved them in multiple places. I made a second folder with a list of witnesses: Mariana, Patricia, Lupita. Each person was a node of memory in case the narrative of events needed corroboration. The legal reality is that memory is softer than paper. Paper is a hard thing, testimony you can hold. Emotionally, I took other steps that felt raw. I stopped trying to smooth things over at dinner. I allowed the silence to be present. I let Diego talk and I listened, not to justify him but to collect words. Sometimes he cried in my presence and asked forgiveness. I held off offering consolation like an automatic bomb. Forgiveness is not an instant. So I stood firm. I listened to facts and I allowed feelings to be spoken, but I did not replace the work of proof with the easiest succor. One afternoon, alone in the kitchen, I took out the old radio and set it to a station my husband used to like. I made coffee and let the scent fill the room. The ordinary rituals had always steadied me. Now they were acts of defiance. I would keep making mole, I would still set the table, but I would also keep the ledger. I was not willing any longer to have my humility used as an unpaid loan. There were nights I sat and wrote everything down, not just numbers but sentences men had said, times they had refused to show me receipts, the tone of helpful words that had actually been commands. I wrote them as if preparing a script. Perhaps one day they would be read aloud in a room where justice had a seat. Each sentence built a scaffolding that underpinned what I knew in my bones. I thought often of the metal box and the notarized letter my husband had left. It felt like an old, small saint that I could set on the table and let it see the light. The papers had been an altar and now, painfully, they were a courtroom evidence. The change in meaning was less about the objects and more about how I saw myself. And then, in a shape I could barely have foreseen, a kind of courage folded into me that was not noisy. It was not fury. It was steadiness. The kind that had carried me through night shifts and births and funerals. I had used that courage then to hold others. Now I would use it to hold myself. I made a decision that felt like a hinge, would confront Diego in a way that left no room for gaslighting. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I wanted to protect what was left of myself. I wanted to be clear about boundaries and consequences. I wanted to make visible what had been hidden for years. So I prepared. I gathered my copies. I rehearsed my words in front of the mirror, not to make them theatrical but to make them precise. I called Mariana and Patricia and arranged a day when the three of them could be present if I needed. The house was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I arranged envelopes, I reviewed dates, I breathed. When the phone rang that night and Diego's name flashed, I let it ring twice and then turned off the lamp. My hands did not shake as they once would have. A small, private part of me smiled because the decision had been made and the path was no longer foggy. I would speak. I would not scream. I would not forgive the theft without restitution. I would demand the facts. I would demand respect. Tomorrow, I would set the table for a different kind of meal. And I would not be alone. The days after I decided to act were quiet, like a room emptied of furniture. My hands moved as if they remembered work my head had not yet vowed to do. I sat at the small kitchen table, the lamp low, and spread the papers like a person laying out a map. I felt raw. I folded and unfolded statements until the edges softened under my fingers. I traced dates with a finger, then with a highlighter. I listened to the hum of the refrigerator and let the numbers speak. Each highlighted line was a small betrayal given a name. Each photocopy was a promise not to be erased. I started by setting out the metal box. It had been under my bed since my husband died. I put it on the table as if it were an altar. The notarized letter, the property title, my INE, the pension slips, everything I had kept, just in case, came out. I handled them slowly, the way I had held newborns at the hospital, careful, unafraid of their weight. I made decisions with the seriousness of suturing a wound. Step 1, make duplicates. Step 2, make them visible. Step 3, make them permanent. I printed the conversations with Eduardo and labeled them. I printed the bank records and stapled them in chronological order. I wrote notes between lines, a date, an accusation, the small explanation I would need later. Each note was a stitch that stopped the bleeding of confusion. Kalei, mas neo skc. I called Mariana that afternoon. Her voice had the same calm rhythm as always. She came with her laptop and a thermos of coffee. We sat at my table and went through everything again, slowly, deliberately. I felt a small knot of fear at the word, court. Then another part of me felt something like relief. There was a road now. The map was not pretty, but it was a road. We listed what to do. I felt the movement of action inside me like blood slamming back into a limb that had been cold. Patricia's calm turned my chaos into tasks. I went to the bank with Patricia. The cool lobbies smelled of new carpet and paper. The teller at first offered a sympathetic, "I'm sorry," the kind people say to be polite. When I slid the printouts across the counter, the teller's expression tightened. A manager appeared. We asked for an internal audit of the accounts and to freeze any standing instructions. The manager took my copies and told me it might take time. He told me the account would be monitored. While they did the formality, a small bureaucratic ritual, Patricia explained the legal language I would later use. "We will request a trace of transfers," she said. "We will ask for CCTV of ATMs where withdrawals occurred, and for any linked accounts showing receipt of funds. We will prepare a formal petition to the bank to reverse unauthorized transactions if possible." She also taught me simple defenses: change passwords, cancel old cards, reclaim any power of attorney. I signed the forms with a steady hand. The paper felt heavier than my memories. Back at home I changed passwords. I wrote them down and then hid the paper in a new place. I opened a new account under my name alone. I chose the bank teller like choosing a watchful neighbor, someone who did not laugh when I asked questions. I asked for SMS alerts and two-factor authentication. I put a small padlock on the drawer where my cards would now rest at night. I cut the power of habit. I moved the small things that had given others access. I stopped handing over envelopes without a copy. I began to carry a list of every withdrawal, every request. The act of writing became a shield, the folder became an armor. A neighbor, Senora Rosa, noticed the shuffle at my window. She came by one afternoon with tamales, curiosity in her eyes. "Everything okay?" she asked, touching the papers with a careful hand as if they might burn. I told her part of the truth and left out the most painful lines. She said what neighbors say: "If you need anything, call." Her offer felt like a thin rope tied to my wrist. There were other small tensions. On a walk to the store, a friend of Carmen's husband made an offhand joke about those silly dating apps older people use. He looked at me, expecting a laugh. I did not laugh. I feel the heat of the memory of that day in the community center, the blue light on my face and the way I had trusted words. The comment stung because it turned my bruises into spectacle. I listened, then walked away. My silence that day was not surrender. It was focus. Kalei, mas neo skc. At night I locked the metal box and slid it under my bed. But I left the table lamp on and the folder open. I wanted the papers to feel like witnesses in the room. I began to catalog witnesses: Mariana, Patricia, Lupita, the bank manager. I wrote their names and phone numbers in the front of the folder. I noted dates when they were present. I made copies and gave them to 2 trusted people. Each copy was a second voice. There was a tiny, private ritual I fell into. I made 2 piles. One pile for evidence and one pile for memory. The evidence pile had receipts, transfers, screenshots, printed conversations. The memory pile had photographs of the years: me in my nurse uniform, Diego as a toddler, birthday cakes with uneven frosting, a photo of my husband and me at some forgotten fairground smiling under a small sun. When I handled the memory pile, I tasted the things I loved. When I arranged the evidence pile, I tasted the resolve I had found. I practiced my words in front of the mirror. Not to be dramatic, but to be precise. I wanted my sentences to cut like a scalpel, simple, clean, true. Diego, I rehearsed, these are the withdrawals you made. Saying it out loud felt like forming a bone in the dark. I called Javier and asked if he could come by more often. He said yes without questions and then added, "Ma, are you sure about this?" He sounded scared, as if he were peeking into a house on fire. I did not answer the fear with explanations. I told him the day and time I wanted everyone at the house. I told him to come with empty hands. There were nights my stomach tightened like a fist. There were small, sharp moments when I wanted to fold the papers back into the box and sleep like the past was still whole. But with each small action I felt less like the woman who had been surprised and more like the woman who would set the terms of her own life. I made an appointment with the notary to revoke the old power of attorney Diego had. The notary's office smelled of dust and varnish. The clerk looked compassionate when I said the words. Paper handed to the clerk felt like a small remedy. The notary's stamp made the revocation real. Patricia prepared the agreement for restitution. She explained what the notary would need: signatures, witnesses, a clause preventing future claims on my property. She asked me how much I wanted to insist on. I quoted the number we had calculated and she did not flinch. She added a schedule of payments. She included an interest clause and a clause that would allow me to press charges if payments stopped. I did not want to break my son's life publicly. I wanted to give him a chance to repair what he had done. I wanted him to recognize the harm. But I would not accept empty promises. I set a deadline and a requirement: notarized signature before the family left the notary. The week arrived like a slow thunder. I rehearsed the logistics, the table in the living room cleared of plates, documents at hand, Patricia arriving early to set the tone. Mariana would be there too. I called both and heard the small comfort in their yes. That Saturday I printed an extra set of copies and tucked them into an envelope. I laid them on the table like a trap that was also a promise. I slept badly. My bones felt full of glass. On Sunday morning I woke before dawn. I made coffee and did not turn on the radio. I wanted the house to be ready. The tablecloth was the one my mother had embroidered. The light through the window fell long and honest. I placed the folder in the center of the table and stood back. I would not be quiet anymore. Tomorrow they would come and I would open the door. I would not be silent any longer. They arrived in pieces, as families do. Diego came in a shirt that still tried to look immaculate. He had the faint smell of cologne and the restless energy of someone who had grown used to being the center of decisions. Carmen came with eyes full of questions that she didn't know how to ask. Javier came with a face like a hammer, the kind of rawness that was both sorrow and anger. They sat at my table and looked at the folder in the center like it might bite. My hands were steady. I poured water into glasses and did not offer food. There was no mole on the table. There was no small talk. The house felt like a room in a courthouse, quiet, the wallpaper an audience. "Why didn't you cook, Mama?" Carmen asked, the question shaped to soften an entry. Her voice trembled on the last syllable. "Because today you are not coming to eat," I said. "You are coming to listen." Silence settled. The children shifted in their chairs. The radio in the other room hummed but was not turned on. The air tasted like held breath. I started at the beginning, because facts need the dignity of a clean start. "A few months ago I met someone online," I said. I said the words plainly. The admission was not dramatic, it was factual. Diego's eyes narrowed. Carmen's lips went pale. Javier leaned forward like a coiled spring. I told them about Eduardo, not with the foolishness they had assumed but with the exactness of what I had learned. I told them about the stolen images, the script of emergencies. The air in the room seemed as if an invisible pressure had been applied. Javier's hand curled into a fist under the table. He had the look of a boy who had been told to wait for a better tomorrow for too long. I spoke to each of them not as if they were strangers, but as people who had known me enough to know the weight of the words I used. I trusted you, I said. I handed you my pension envelope every month. I trusted you because you called me Ma, and because you were hungry once and I fed you. The memory of those hungry hands softened the edges of my anger. But trusting is not giving permission to take. Patricia had prepared a document. She slid it across to Diego. We can do this two ways, she said. We can sign a restitution agreement today. It will be notarized and legally binding. Or we can proceed with a criminal complaint and civil action. The choice is yours. Diego's face went pale. He looked at me as if trying to find the old woman who had once let him take her hand without question. Mama, he said, would never. You already did, I said, and the syllable landed like a verdict. You already took. The conversation escalated into a series of small explosions. Diego tried to explain, to reframe, to make the withdrawals sound like gestures of care. I invested it for you, he said. I put it into accounts that would help you later. I was protecting you. Protection is asking, I replied. Protection is telling me and showing me the documents. You did not show me anything. You made decisions in my name without my permission. Carmen sniffed. You always did the right thing, Mama, she said, then turned a pleading look at Diego. Say something. Please. Javier could not be contained. You told me we didn't have money for college, he shouted. You told me she couldn't help me. You said, Ma doesn't have it. And then there you were in Mexico and in Cancun. How did that happen? Diego's face folded in on itself. He tried to stand on the excuse that he had used the money for family needs. The excuses piled like thin paper. They were flammable and fragile. Patricia spoke then, with the bluntness of an instrument. We will not resolve this with words in a living room, she said. We need signatures. We need evidence. Ms. Navarro has given both. The bank has been notified. The notary is ready. Diego looked at the paper again. His hand shook. He was a man confronting the consequences of behaviors he had assumed were private. There was an attempt at negotiation. It will take a while, he stammered. Let me arrange payments. Not in promises, Patricia replied. A notarized agreement. Schedule. Interest. Witnesses. If you do not agree, we will file. The air grew colder. I watched my son weigh two futures. One of them involved paying, slowly, and trying to rebuild his mother into someone he thought he had not damaged. The other involved legal exposure. You expect me to sign that? He asked finally. His voice was small. You expect me to sign this and now? Yes, I said. Sign it now. As my son. As the man I raised. Or sign it later in court. Diego's eyes glistened with something that might have been shame. He took the pen with a trembling hand and signed. He signed the schedule. He signed the clause that renounced future claims to my property. The signature was small and machine-like. Javier's shoulders loosened a little as if a storm had moved over him. Carmen wept softly and tried to do what daughters must do, to bridge wounds with care. Patricia notarized the document with the indifferent efficiency of someone trained to turn human mess into legal certainty. There was a moment when the weight lifted from my shoulders like a bird taking flight. But the room did not change into a family reunion. There was the cracked silence of something broken but still living. The trust had been fractured. The sound of the pages fluttered like a damaged heart. Then the practical measures began. We walked to the notary's office 3 blocks away. The sun grazed the buildings and I felt the concrete under my shoes as if it were a new truth. We signed more papers. Diego signed the renunciation. He spoke a few words of apology that sounded filmy and inadequate. I accepted them because it was a door to something else, not because they repaired the harm. After the notary, we went to the bank. The manager now looked at me with a different face. He had seen the documents. He helped me open a new account in my name. Together with Patricia, we asked for the bank to monitor the payments Diego would make. The bank agreed to send monthly statements to Patricia and to me. They froze previous authorizations under my name. The machine of the institution moved as institutions do, slow but exact. Outside the bank, Javier hugged me. He said nothing. His embrace felt like apology and possibility. Carmen apologized with a soft voice that sounded like someone trying to stitch fabric with trembling hands. Diego stood a little away, as one who had taken a step into a new life that would have to be paid back. Consequences were not theatrical. They were administrative. They were the notary's stamp, the bank manager's file, the schedule of payments. They were a set of changes that would, if honored, restore money to my account in pieces. They would not fully restore the time and trust stolen, but they were a real, concrete attempt to undo a theft. I left the bank with my shoulders lighter but not free. I had gained restitution on paper and changed the pattern of access. I had also marked a point of no return in family dynamics. The table in my house had become an instrument of reckoning. Some people left the table to go home. Some stayed. We arranged future oversight measures. Patricia stayed with me for a while and explained what would happen if payments were late, or if Diego stopped. "We will proceed," she said. "We will file for enforcement. We will deposit proof with the court if necessary." On the way home, the city felt ordinary. People were walking dogs, a vendor shouted about fruit. Life moved in its indifferent rhythm. I felt my heart beating and knew it was the heart of a woman who had learned to count the price of her dignity. That night I lay awake and thought of the future, the plans I might make now, the trips I could take, the small repairs to my home. I thought of the times when I had remained silent to keep peace and how that silence had become the door through which my savings had vanished. I had set a boundary that afternoon that would alter everything. I stepped over that boundary and into the quiet after the storm. The house was steadier, but there were new distances, and a new map that none of us had chosen. The next morning, a message arrived on my phone that made me sit up. It was a bank notification. A payment had been made, just as the paper said it would be. The number on the screen was small and real. It was the first of many. But the word "first" is a long one to carry. Tomorrow would be a test of whether words would become actions. I was ready to watch. 6 months later, the small changes had become my new ordinary. The apartment looked the way someone who is paying attention arranges things. The radio in the corner, my mother's embroidered cloth over the armchair, a new television against the wall that finally showed me colors I had been avoiding. The red ribbon my mother used to tie to tables was attached to the leg of mine. It felt like a tiny charm and a claim. Diego paid on time. The deposits arrived with the small precision of a ritual. He sent numbers and receipts. I checked them and logged them into my ledger. That ritual verifying became a way I spoke to myself. I was not naive anymore. I was careful. I was practical. I was whole in a new way. Our relationship was cautious. We saw each other at birthdays. We exchanged brief, polite phrases. There was no longer the private room where he could act without consequence. He learned, if someone is helping, ask to be shown the receipts. Do not be ashamed to ask for help from a lawyer, a trusted friend, or the bank. They clapped small, honest claps. One woman hugged me afterward and whispered, "You gave me permission to ask my daughter for the bank password." I felt a strange, fierce relief. My voice was back, and it had found a public place that made it useful. There were nights, of course, when the walls of the apartment seemed too thin. I would wake suddenly and remember the empty spot where the savings had been. I would imagine a different life where vacations and repairs had not been delayed and where the small comforts I wanted were already mine. The grief did not leave, it softened into a companion who reminded me to be cautious. I bought the plane ticket to Oaxaca for next spring. I had waited a lifetime to go, and it would be the trip my mother spoke of in her old kitchen when the radio played an old song and she would look at the horizon and tell a story. Now I would go because I could, because I had taken back my life enough to make a small pilgrimage. My new credit card came in the mail like a friend with a promise. It was an ordinary rectangle, but in my hands it felt like a tiny flag planted in my own territory. I registered it, set alerts, and tucked the number into a small notebook that I kept locked. I had built safeguards that felt like a fence, passwords, a second contact number, monthly statements sent to my email and to Patricia's office. On my birthday I invited only 3 people, Lupita, Mariana, and Patricia. We sat around my table, the small lamp making pools of light. We toasted with mezcal and laughed at a joke only the 3 of them understood. We ate mole, and the portion of cake I cut was imperfect but mine. It was small and glowing. It felt like a circle closed with careful hands. "I wouldn't have come if I didn't think you'd laugh again," Lupita said with a grin. "But you are stubborn in the best way." I laughed. There was a softness in my chest that had little to do with the tequila and much to do with the sense of being held. These women had steadied me. They had taught me how to keep records, how to fight, and how to stand in my own authority. People ask me, sometimes in private messages on the community center's page, "What would you do if it happened again?" I tell them, prepare. I teach them small practical moves: get a second email, make photocopies of keys documents, keep a daily ledger, never give full control of your finances to one person, and speak to a lawyer if anything looks odd. I tell them also to find someone like Mariana, a teacher who will not judge but will show you how to use tools. And I tell them, ask your bank questions. Banks have processes. They can act when you bring them evidence. Sometimes I hear people say, "But it was your son." They say it with a soft quickness meant to excuse. I do not need to explain my love. Love is not the opposite of boundaries. Love is not the opposite of accountability. I learned that lesson the hard way. I learned that the work of love sometimes involves setting limits that hurt but protect. There are still invitations I decline. There are loans I refuse. I say no more than I used to. The word tastes awkward in my mouth sometimes, but I wear it like a sweater that keeps out the cold. Diego called one evening and left a voice message that was shorter than most. He sounded older, quieter. "Ma," he said, "thank you for not giving up on me." He asked if he could visit in a couple of weeks to bring something for the house. I called him back and set a time. I gave him instructions about the bank receipts. He accepted them without protest. Little by little our transactions became healthier. One night I sat in front of the small radio and listened to a song my husband used to like. I made coffee and poured a cup for myself and thought about the years when I had taken care of everyone. I thought about the nights on call when I did not stop for a moment and the small things I did so my children could grow. I did not regret my life. I only wished I had been more taught the way Mariana taught me about protecting the life you build. I am saving for Oaxaca, small amounts deposited each month into the account I now control. I look at the map sometimes and point to the places I want to see, like a child making plans for the future. The trip is not an escape, it is a step toward a life I will spend on my own terms. What I lost cannot be returned by money alone. What I recovered was something less tangible but more fierce, my voice, my choice, my order. The money was important. The money buys small freedoms. But the voice is the engine that keeps those freedoms from being stolen again. If you are watching and you have felt the ache I am talking about, or if you have felt the sting of being dismissed because of your age or your kindness, I want to ask you one thing. What would you do if you discovered that the person who should have protected you had taken from you? Think about it. Leave a comment below with your city or country. Tell me if you have a story. If you need resources, look to local legal aid or a community center like mine. Talk to someone. Keep copies. Change your passwords. Keep your card in a locked place. I am not a different woman because of this. I am the same woman with a different spine. I learned that being soft does not mean being soft-hearted about protection. I learned to speak and to ask for help. I will not pretend all wounds heal. Some are like the scar on my hand, visible, a reminder of repair. Some days the tiredness returns. But I sleep with the knowledge that I did not let them write my end. If this story reached you, if it gave you a small piece of courage, then it has done what I needed it to do. Will you share your story below?